Benvenuti, amici. That means, in Italian, welcome, friends. Now, why Italian this time around? Well, that's because in this session we're going to start studying the Renaissance, and the Renaissance begins in Italy. Now, in our last session, we were examining the transitional period at the end of the Middle Ages leading up to the Renaissance. We saw how, as a result of the Crusades, we had economic growth, we had the return of sort of political stability, economic stability, education, learning, and so now that transitional period is rolling into a new era of history that historians call the Renaissance. So on to the essential questions. What will we be looking at specifically here? Well, what is the Renaissance? We might as well define it if we're going to study it. Where did the Renaissance begin? Well, I kind of told you that one already. It's Italy, as if the map on the left didn't give that away. But more importantly, why did the Renaissance begin in Italy? Why not somewhere else? Additionally, we're going to examine the main philosophical bent of the Italian Renaissance. That's something called humanism. And this philosophical ideology is going to drive a lot of what changes in Italy and really the rest of Europe in the years to come. What are the basics of humanist philosophy, and how does humanism impact society and the arts during this era of the Renaissance? And you cannot talk about the Renaissance without bringing up some of the great masters of the Italian Renaissance. And obviously the list of ones that I'm going to give you here are by no means a complete list of the great masters. I'm going to pull out some of my bias and just mention some of my favorite ones, and I promise you, though, we'll talk about more of them in class, and we will view and examine their artworks in class as well. Not enough time to do it in the screencast here today, but those are the essential questions. So without further ado, let's go ahead and begin. All right, the Renaissance. If we're going to define it in any way, shape, or form, let's just go straight to the nuts and bolts, okay? From 1350 to 1600, Western Europe is experiencing this rather profound social and cultural awakening. This period of awakening is what is known as the Renaissance. And Renaissance is actually a French word that means rebirth. And that is essentially what is going on here in Europe. It's sort of a rebirth. And again, people living during this time period did not, walk out the door in the morning and go, "Yeah, it's awesome to live during this cultural reawakening. I love living in the Renaissance." People living in this time didn't really have a concept that they were experiencing this major change event, this major change period in Europe. It was later historians who go back and study this time period, and in comparing this to the earlier medieval period, what they see is a rebirth. They see a major change that really was taking place. So is the Renaissance a thing? Yeah, it was. For people living during that time, they maybe didn't realize the major change that was taking place, but it indeed is a huge change in the course of events and culture for Italy and later on for the rest of Europe. And historians really see the Renaissance as the beginning of what we might call modern history. I know 14, 15, 1600s doesn't sound very modern, but that's the era in which they put it. And if you're wondering, historians like to put us in what we might call the postmodern period, but that's a story for another day. Okay, so the Renaissance, we already know that it begins in Italy, but the question here is why? Why begin in Italy? Why not France? Why not the German states? Why not England? Well, Italy has a handful of things going for it that make it an ideal location for this cultural reawakening to take place. Italy, first and foremost, had a pretty stable economy. Italy had escaped the economic crisis that was feudalism, which was going on in the rest of Western Europe, and on top of that, the Italian cities and the Italian states had gained huge amounts of wealth in the past couple of hundred years, largely because of trade with the East. Because remember, after the Crusades, and we see this uptick in East-West trade, if you wanted to get your trade goods into Europe, Italy was very much the gateway. Okay, you had to go through Italy to get to the rest of Europe. So the cities in Italy that sat along these trade routes became very, very wealthy. And the other cities that didn't necessarily sit along the trade routes, they had sort of some niche industry that helped to make them wealthy. For all this painting and art and cultural rebirth that's going to take place, it's going to cost money, and the Italian cities have strong, stable economies to be able to fund this stuff. Furthermore, the Italian cities are in very close contact with the Byzantine Empire. And if you remember, the Byzantine Empire is just the eastern half of the old Roman Empire. And there in the Byzantine Empire, they had preserved and had access to the classical learning and writing of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And Italy, with close contact to the Byzantines, had access to this information also. And so as knowledge is coming back into Europe, Italy is the first place where it really takes roots. And this is why the Renaissance begins in Italy. And it's really the cities of Italy that are incredibly important in the Renaissance. And the most important Italian Renaissance cities are places like Florence, Rome, and Venice. Venice is the wealthiest of all of them, but we should also give credit to places like Milan and Siena and Genoa. These are also important cities of the Renaissance. And in these cities, Italian scholars are developing a very strong new interest in the classical writings of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. They suddenly have access to this stuff again. And this interest in the classics of ancient Greece and ancient Rome leads to this new intellectual movement that is called humanism. And humanists hold a deep admiration for classical Greek and Roman culture. And they demonstrate this admiration for the culture by improving their understanding of Greek and Latin. Why do that? Well, the ancient texts of Greek and Roman are written in Greek and Latin. So if you want to understand them, you got to learn the languages. And so they learn the languages so they can study the old manuscripts, and they really gain a great appreciation for the culture and the beliefs and the ideologies of these past great civilizations. And on top of that, not only do they understand it and really admire it, but they want to try to copy it as well. They copy the writing styles, and they even try to copy some of the cultural beliefs and ways of living and acting in this world. In their admiration of classical Greece and Rome, the humanists adopt a lot of the classical cultural beliefs of the Greeks and Romans. They say imitation is the highest form of flattery, and that's exactly what the humanists are doing. They want to think, and they want to live, and they want to be like these great classical civilizations. In a lot of ways, that's what the Renaissance is. We think of the Renaissance as being this magical rebirth of Europe. Well, really, what it is a rebirth of classical Greek and Roman ideas. This rebirth is really just a copying of the old great ideas from the Greeks and the Romans. And one of the ideas that humanists really cling to is a rejection of the medieval philosophy of life. You see, the medieval philosophy of life is that life sucks, and there's not much you can do about it. That in this life on earth, all you can really expect is suffering and hardship. And that the only time you could expect comfort and happiness is when you died and went to heaven. And so there's a huge emphasis in medieval philosophy on just sort of making your way through this life on earth, doing what you had to do so you could achieve salvation and get to heaven. In the medieval philosophy, you're not an individual, you're not important, you're sort of like this wayward soul floating through purgatory, waiting to die so you can achieve salvation. And humanist scholars of the Italian Renaissance, they really reject this idea. And instead, they adopt the Greek and Roman belief of, crazy idea here, enjoying life on earth. I know it sounds crazy, but in the medieval period there wasn't really a whole lot to enjoy. But humanists believe in this classical Greek and Roman idea of seeking fulfillment in daily life, putting a lot more emphasis on life on this earth. This is not to say that people still weren't worried about the afterlife and salvation. This is not to say that people weren't religious, because they were still very religious. They were still, wanting to get to heaven, but there was a lot more emphasis on living and enjoying and seeking fulfillment in this life on this earth, finding things you enjoy doing and doing them, and then learning other things and just seizing the day, or in the Latin it's carpe diem, if anybody's ever seen the old movie Dead Poets Society. That's classic humanist ideology. Seize the day, go out and enjoy life and seek fulfillment, seek individuality, the idea that each person has dignity and worth, and you're not just some wayward soul floating in purgatory. They really appreciate the classical Greek and Roman concept that the ideal person is someone who does lots and lots of stuff. If you like art, that's great. Paint and do sculpture. But go beyond that. Don't just be an artist. Be a writer. Study math and science. Take part in sports. Study music. Get involved in politics. Do lots and lots of things. This is what the Greeks and Romans did. And as this is a rebirth of Greek and Roman ideology, this is what the humanists really push, that the ideal individual is one who takes part in a lot of different activities. And today we call this kind of person a Renaissance man, because that is the ideal person from the era of the Renaissance. Now, humanism has a huge impact on the arts in the Italian Renaissance. A lot of what characterizes the Italian Renaissance is its art. And because humanism puts such an emphasis on individualism and individual talent, artists and writers were really inspired to express their own emotions and values and attitudes in their work. And artists and writers really wanted their work to reflect real life, to make their subjects as lifelike as possible. And although much of the art is still devoted to religion, because again, just because people are focusing more on life on this earth doesn't mean they're giving up on religion, there is a lot more of a secular overtone to the work. And some of the really popular subjects are things like Greek and Roman mythology. On the left-hand side there on the bottom, we can see Raphael's School of Athens that depicts a scene from Plato's Academy in which all the great minds of ancient Greece are all in one place. That's classical Greek influence on that painting. In the middle, you have Botticelli's very famous Birth of Venus, Venus being the Roman incarnation of the Greek goddess Aphrodite. But the focus of the subject here is, of course, Greek and Roman mythology. If you really want to see the biggest, most stark difference in medieval period to Renaissance, you have to look at the art. Painting during the medieval period is flat. It's boring. It's religiously symbolic. There's not a lot of life to it. Here on the right, we've got a medieval version of The Last Supper. You can see all the characters involved. They look exactly alike. There is no difference between any of them. It's not realistic. It's not lifelike in any way, shape, or form. Really pretty boring. You compare that to Leonardo da Vinci's version of The Last Supper, seen here below, and you can really catch the difference in the development of art and ideology from the medieval period to the Renaissance. In the Renaissance, they wanted their work to look more lifelike. It reflects that rebirth of Greek and Roman humanist ideology. Artists would study anatomy. They wanted to portray people accurately and naturally. They wanted their subjects to show gestures and have expressions of emotion. Da Vinci's version of The Last Supper is not just a classical religious painting, but he wanted to throw sort of a monkey wrench in it by having his scene being the moment right after Jesus says, "One of you guys is going to betray me." And so instead of a serene Passover meal, it is chaos and finger pointing, and it's not me, it's him, who's going to do it? And then the focal point of the whole thing is, of course, Jesus in the middle. It's a huge difference between the medieval version, of course, and the Renaissance version, and sculpture is no different. Like medieval paintings, medieval sculpture was stiff and stylized, very boring, not a lot of creativity, not as much skill involved in it, usually religious in nature. The one on the right here isn't a religious scene. It's just a man and a woman, but it's carved in relief onto a piece of stone. Very boring, very flat. You get to the Renaissance, and it's a return to the classical ideas of the Greeks and the Romans. Huge freestanding statues of powerful, intense figures sculpted out of bronze or marble, and a lot of times also naked. I mean, in Greece and Rome, the human body was viewed as an art form, and that's the way they did a lot of art. And since this is sort of a rebirth of classical Greek and Rome, it's not surprising that the naked part carries over as well. So you can't talk Renaissance without giving a shout out to some of the great masters. And I'm only going to name a few here. There's a lot more than this. We're going to talk about more of them in class. But the first one I have to cover, one of my personal favorites, Niccolo Machiavelli, a writer during the Renaissance and many other things, although his importance in writing didn't really become apparent until after his death. And his most widely read and important book was a little something called The Prince. Now, Machiavelli was a politician, an avid studier of history and politics. Bias alert, I guess that's why I like him. And in this book, The Prince, Machiavelli analyzed politics in Italy because he wanted to study how successful leaders gained and kept power. What he found was that in Italy, leaders would lie, cheat, steal, kill, use force, use any means necessary in order to gain power. Really the book can be summed up in one line, and that's the ends justify the means. More on him in class. Can't talk Renaissance without talking this guy, Leonardo da Vinci, really the greatest master of the Renaissance. And he's not just a great artist, but he is the quintessential version of the Renaissance man, because he excels in so many fields. He's a scientist. He studies astronomy, mathematics, anatomy. He writes books on all these subjects. He's an inventor, came up with designs for flying machines, military weapons, hundreds of years before they would ever actually be developed. And of course, he's a great Renaissance artist. He skillfully portrays subjects' personalities and thoughts and feelings, and these characteristics are very well seen in some of his best works, like the Mona Lisa and The Last Supper of Jesus. One of Da Vinci's contemporaries and rivals was the great sculptor Michelangelo. Now, Michelangelo is again a Renaissance man, because he's not just a sculptor, but he's also a writer and a painter. And his sculptures are huge, gigantic, muscular individuals that indicate the power and vitality of humanity. His most famous works involve the Statue of David, but his most famous painting is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, which he painted with scenes from the Bible. Well, I kind of blew through those guys there at the end, but we touched on the start of the Renaissance here, what the Renaissance is, where it started, Italy, and why. Looked at humanism, that philosophy, and the impact that it has on society in the Italian Renaissance, and we hit on our masters of the Italian